Hello and welcome to our series where we are looking at works in the domain of history that offer us, fresh insights on how to do historical analysis and how to write history and what we can use history for. And today I'd like to talk about a book that is very interesting to me, which is Amin Maalouf's The Crusades Through Arab Eyes. Now, the topic of the Crusades, of course, is a topic that has been written at length by many authors all over the world, and many of us are familiar with the writings on the topic of the Crusades. People like Stephen Runciman have written about it. However, what is interesting about Amin Maalouf's work is that he chooses to look at the same event or events, but through a very different perspective. That is, through the perspective of the Arabs, whose accounts of the Crusades were somewhat different to the European accounts that have featured prominently in many historical writings about the Crusades. Now, from the outset, Amin Maalouf's argument is a simple one, but an important one. Namely, that when we think and talk about the Crusades, we have to remember that this was a very complex and long conflict between two opposing sides, but thus far, much of what has been written about the Crusades has been one-sided in the sense that it's been uh, written from sources that are European in origin. The novel feature of Maalouf's work is that he looks at Arab chroniclers, Arab historians who experienced the Crusades firsthand and who wrote about it, from their own perspective. There are a number of very interesting points that Maalouf raises in this book. The first is that he argues that although the Crusades features very prominently in the writings of Western historians as an important landmark event that marks the birth of modern Europe as we know it today, um, for Arab scholars at the time, however, the Crusades were seen as a isolated event that took place far away at the borders of the Muslim world. And this leads us to the second point that he raises. Um, Maalouf reminds us that the Muslim world during the time of the Crusades was truly a global environment that stretched all the way from North Africa all the way to Central Asia. And by then, there had emerged many centers of political activity, economic activity, many centers of civilizational production and contact from the Persian Empire, cities like Baghdad, the emerging Muslim states in Central Asia and later South Asia. And so the center of the Muslim world had actually moved further to the east. And so what was happening in the disputed territories where the Europeans were invading were actually at the fringes of a much wider, a much more complex Muslim world. And this is an important point that we need to take into account, because what Maalouf shows to us is that by the time of the Crusades, when the Europeans were slowly emerging from what they regarded as their dark ages, the Arab Muslim world had actually evolved on par with the civilizations of India and China to greater heights, and where the Muslim world was far more cosmopolitan, far more multicultural, and in a sense, far more civilized than Western Europe itself. This is an interesting counterpoint to the kind of narratives that we hear again and again, um, especially today, where the Crusades are often referred to as a point of conflict and serves a kind of political or ideological function in the kind of political language that we encounter when we look at the media or when we read reports about the Arab world. Maalouf's point here is that yes, while the Crusades were an important event, they were not the only event that shaped the Muslim world. The Muslim world was already ahead in so many other fields in terms of science and philosophy, of technology, of the humanities. And this is something which provides a very different perspective, a different reading of the Crusades, and it places the Crusades at perhaps a different status, a different level of importance as far as the Arab Muslim world was concerned at the time. The reason why I think this book is an important book to read is that it reminds us that when we talk about historical events such as the Crusades, we have to remember that many of these events are multifaceted events that involve a multiplicity of actors, and that it is important uh, when we write histories like this, or say the history of colonization or the history of the First World War or the Second World War, to remember that we need to take into account the different perspectives and the different worldviews of the different actors who were involved. The other important thing that comes from Maalouf's book is that it reminds us that when we talk about the Crusades, it cannot be seen as a singularity. And this is what Maalouf really foregrounds in his analysis. He reminds us that while the Crusades may have played a very important role for Europeans, to Europeans, in the formation of a Western European identity, for the Muslim world, many parts of the Muslim world that were far away from the scene of conflict regarded this as a distant event, and they were more preoccupied with other matters, economic relations with other parts of Asia, economic relations with other parts of Africa. So in other words, life went on as normal, as usual for other parts of the Muslim world. This is an important reminder for us because it makes us question this tendency in historical analysis to see events as singular things. What Maalouf's book does is that it reminds us of the fact that the Crusades, which were a series of conflicts, cannot be seen as a kind of singular set of events, but rather as a set of events that can be interpreted in very different ways. A good book to read alongside this will be Peter Carey's excellent study of the British in Java, seen through the perspective of the Javanese. In Peter Carey's book, which I will discuss in another video, Peter Carey gives a very interesting account of how the British occupation of Java was seen in a very different way by the Javanese, who felt themselves now colonized by the British. So in works such as this, what we have is multi-perspective readings of history. And this multi-perspective approach, I think, is a very important approach for us to consider, particularly for those of us who enjoy history and those of us who write history.